Burnout is the final thing that happens. I mean, it can be mental, physical, emotional, where you're just simply exhausted. And when that happens, it is not subtle. But even then, depending on the culture you're in, persons may blame the individual who suffered burnout and simply say, they did not know how to manage their job, how to manage the projects that they had, etc.
Can you spot the signs of burnout, stress, and anxiety in yourself? How about in others? Have you ever thought about the root causes of these issues, at least in the workplace? If the answer to that last question is yes, then I'd wager the answers you came up with were probably variations on themes like being overworked, external pressures, workplace culture, demanding bosses, and so on. But what about discrimination? Have you ever thought about that interconnection to things like stress and burnout? My guest today is Dr. Frank Douglas. He's an award-winning industry veteran, board member, CEO, and author with 3 decades of experience in a range of industries, including healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and entrepreneurship. He is also an expert in workplace stress and anxiety, particularly when it is the result of systemic discrimination. In his latest book, Frank discusses this problem and proposes what I think, anyway, is an insightful, impactful way to reframe and overcome. Today, we'll be learning more about that reframing methodology. We'll be hearing Frank's story from growing up in Guyana, emigrating to the USA, and his experiences at college during a pivotal period of history in the American civil rights movement. And then after completing his studies, his exposure to discrimination at work, where that subsequently led his career, and the 2 or 3 career pivots that he's taken on his journey so far. And of course, how and why this taught him key lessons about managing stress, workplace anxiety, leadership, and more. This is going to be an episode full of relevant, insightful, and meaningful lessons and stories from a unique perspective, and it fits perfectly within our mini-series on burnout and stress at work that we're doing at the moment. There is much to learn today, and Dr. Frank is an excellent teacher speaking from experience that you really can't argue with. So make sure you're sitting comfortably and don't miss out on this episode.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Well, I'm joined today by Dr. Frank Douglas. Frank, thank you so much for being on the show. Welcome to Leading with Integrity.
Thank you.
And to kick us off, to make a start, over to you really to tell the listeners a bit about yourself, your career so far, your background, what you do today and why you do it.
And why I do it, that is important.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and my background probably explains that.
Mm-hmm.
I actually was born in Guyana, what was British Uganda at the time, came to America in 1963 on a Fulbright scholarship as an undergraduate. Why that is important is that I arrived in America, in New York, actually, about 8 days before Dr. Martin Luther King's March on Washington, in which I learned sometime after that he had made this very famous statement that he wished that his children one day would be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. And shortly after arriving in America, I began to experience discrimination based on the color of my skin. So that was my introduction to America. I went to Lehigh University, where I studied engineering, then on to Cornell University, where I did the PhD in physical chemistry. Worked for Xerox for a very brief time, but incidences of discrimination there led me to leave and go to medical school. So I'm also a medical doctor, and in fact, then spent a great part of my life in the medical field. But interestingly enough, I cycled back into the lab-based side of things. So I went back to I went not back, but I went to the pharmaceutical industry and spent most of my life in the pharmaceutical industry, ultimately becoming a member of the board of management for Hertz Marnucel, which became Aventis, which is now Sanofi, and led research, development, and regulatory affairs for many years. And have been very fortunate. The scientists whom I led contributed to more than 25 drugs on the market, drugs such as Lactus to treat diabetes, Taxotere for cancer, Allegra for seasonal rhinitis, etc. On retiring from the industry, I went back to academia. I was a professor of the practice at MIT, a professor at the University of Akron. Retired after about 6-7 years of that, and ran a small startup biotech company for a short while. Then went into my third retirement. And in May of 2020, like many people, I was watching the TV transfixed, looking at the murder of George Floyd. And something occurred to me, and that led me to establish my startup company, Safe Haven Dialogues, to really focus on helping individuals to deal with discrimination. So that's my passion now. I use what is called the Reframing methodology, and I'd be happy to tell you more about that. But that's my background and gives you a sense of why I do what I do now.
Wow. Okay. So 3 retirements, was it? Right.
Yes. I'm now working on my towards my 4th retirement.
Incredible. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess as long as you're enjoying what you do and you feel like it's important and it has meaning, I mean, why stop, you know?
Well, I tell people retirement is doing what you really love to do at your own time and pace.
Oh, interesting. Well, in that case, I'm semi-retired. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, such an interesting period of history as well. I mean, obviously very important stuff going on, but I mean, what did it feel like to be part of that, I guess, moment of history?
Well, it's fascinating because you look at it this way. I arrived in America in 1963. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. Early 1973, Roe versus Wade, abortion, the right of women to decide on their personal health, that was passed. You know, the whole notion of affirmative action was launched in 1961, before I got here, with the establishment of the Equal Employment Opportunity Committee. So I saw that transition going on in America and benefited from it. As I tell people, in fact, people ask me, what is DEI? What is diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, I just mentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion became basically a slogan to encapsulate those laws and executive orders that focused on affirmative action and voting rights, civil rights, etc. That's what DEI is about. So I came to America at that time of tremendous social changes. Was the wrapping up also of the war in Vietnam. As I pointed to people, is that what people don't realize, in 1966, you had the demonstrations against the war in Vietnam. You had the Black Power movement ongoing. It was the birth of NOW, the National Organization of Women. So on many social fronts, things were happening in that time period, and I had a front row seat. And now to me, to see the changes that are going on in America, and the decisions being made by the Supreme Court, it is going back to a pre-1960s time that I find very difficult to understand. After so much progress, this violent lurch to the past, very strange to me and troubling.
I don't think you're alone in that. I mean, certainly from the outside, I mean, we're certainly in no position to throw stones in the UK either on a lot of these issues. But yeah, it does seem a bit bizarre. And I think a step backwards, I think is the right way to describe it, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, that's politics, I suppose, fortunate as it may be.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting perspective you must have on that, having gone through the immigration experience as well and coming into the States at that time as an outsider, effectively, to start with. Did it occur to you at the time how meaningful this was going to be for the future?
Well, it was very vivid for me for two reasons. One, I was at the Cornell University, which was a politically very active campus. In fact, Cornell University was the one campus in which Black students exited the student union, which they had taken over with guns, as they were told that they were students who had guns who were going to attack them when they exited. So they were able to get someone to supply them with guns. So they exited with guns. And there's this famous picture on the Time magazine, from the cover of Time magazine, as these two students entered. I won't comment on what my own personal involvement was at that time, but just simply to say that, of course, I had a front row seat, and I was very sympathetic, because the one thing I told people is that for white Americans, I was Black. It had nothing to do. When I spoke and they heard an accent, some of them apologized and would say, "Well, no, I thought you were a Black American. We have nothing against you. It has to do with Black Americans." But there was the experience of being judged by the color of my skin. I was Black, period. Yeah, and so it's interesting for me, having lived through that and now seeing this, tremendous change, as I say, the lurch back to the past. It's I can't understand it. And I've said to individuals who have asked me, how do I put this together? I said, for me, there is only one explanation, and that is that in a number of individuals, the hatred for anything that's different, for people that are different from them, is so strong that it is actually now driving what is clear a white supremacy movement. What was also very strange for me is because I grew up in the evangelical church in Guyana, and it became sort of one when I was faced with it. I could not understand that I could not go to some of the white churches when it was the white missionaries who taught us we must all love each other. We were all going to go to heaven and be together. So that was strange to me. But now it's even more bizarre because, as I tell people, one of the disciples asked Christ, "What is the greatest commandment?" And he said, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart." And without being prompted, he continued, and the second is like unto it, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." So to see evangelical Christians in America spewing hatred and talking about white supremacy and white nationalism, where's the Christianity in that? So this to me is really bizarre.
Bizarre is a good word, isn't it? I guess it's like so many religions, isn't it? Like the real issue comes not in the aspiration or what's being preached, but more in the human flawed interpretation of that. So, I mean, even, I'm not defending anyone at all in this situation, but in their minds, I can imagine the ways they can justify it. So, like, how do you define your neighbor, for example? In a lot of ways, it's the great strength of humanity, and in a lot of ways, it's the greatest weakness, isn't it? Is our ability to sort of self-delude or just come up with whatever narrative in our own mind we need to in order to fit or excuse or explain our behavior, which may look really extreme and idiotic to others.
No, I smiled when you said aspirational, because I've been asked the question frequently: how do I explain companies who you read what they have on their website, you read their annual report, and they talk about their core values, their principles, etc., and the culture that they build. And I said, that's their aspirational culture. I said, however, you go, and I will take a university as an organization, because for me, it's the best example. You go to a university, which has many colleges or many departments, and so there's the aspirational culture. But you go to any department, and that may have a life of its own. And so there's an actual culture that may be slightly different or very different from the aspirational culture. And then there's something that we actually miss, which is where we now get into the issue of discrimination of any type. It doesn't just have to be racist, it can be gender, it can be age, it can be sexual orientation, etc. There is the experience culture, what an individual is experiencing in the setting that they're in. And that can be vastly different from the aspirational culture. So, people say, well, this company says, here are their core values, etc. But here there was a class action lawsuit, from women who are being discriminated against, being paid less than men, getting fewer opportunities in spite of their accomplishments, etc., within the company. Said, well, there you go. There is the difference between the aspirational, the actual, and the experience.
Yeah, I think particularly in kind of the modern business world, there's an added complexity to that as well, isn't there? Which is the sort of the PR and marketing view of it all. And yeah. I feel like how many of those like value statements are just driven by what we want people to think the company is like versus what we actually want the company to be like, and then again what it really is like to work at. Then again, you've got to start somewhere. The aspirational bit, that's step one, isn't it?
Yes.
But how many companies, I would suggest not enough, actually go to steps 2 and steps 3 and then actually embed that culture throughout and consistently throughout the whole organization as well.
The truth of the matter is, anyone or organization that has no aspirations ultimately dies.
True. It's a fair point. So one of the other things that I know you have an interest in and that you speak about and possibly done some work on is stress and anxiety in the workplace. Now, that feels like a tangent from what we've been talking about, but I also think maybe it's actually an extension, isn't it? Because in a lot of workplaces, it's going to be the result of some of these other issues we just talked about. Burnout is the other buzzword at the moment, isn't it? Why do you think these mental health challenges in particular are overlooked in the workplace? And what can we do to improve the outcomes of people who face these issues?
Well, so many things basically happen because of frank ignorance. We just don't know. And last year, the Boston Medical Institution published a study. They had followed 48,000 Black women for over 20 years in the health program that they had. And what they discovered is that those Black women who reported problems of discrimination at work, dealing with the police or dealing with housing, had a 26% higher incidence of coronary artery disease and a higher incidence of stroke occurring at an earlier age. And Gallup, the famous group, they've been doing a lot of work in this area over many, many years. And they actually have demonstrated that companies who have very good attitudes, support for their employees, and who are in the top quartile tend to have much better engagement and motivation of their employees, which leads to 25% greater productivity and profitability, for example, than those in the bottom quartile. And they have made a connection between well-being. They've done the studies and made a connection between well-being and stress in the workplace. And it's just been an area of ignorance. We have seen it, and we've excused it in various ways. Oh, that person is probably just not capable. That person is overextended, and not looking at the culture in which that person is working, which is contributing to the stress. So there's just been a lot of ignorance around this, but people are beginning to realize the connection between stress and anxiety in the workplace and well-being on the one hand, and as a result, productivity on the other hand. As a matter of fact, when I created Safe Haven Dialogues, I did not use DEI. I used EIIE, namely equity, inclusion, and individual engagement. Because my view is that every organization, starting from the family, is based on two things, based on equity and inclusion. And equity has to do with the rules that have been set down by the leaders, the parents. This is how we behave. This is how we get things done. These are the guidelines, if you like, the rules. And then inclusion is what the workers, the frontline supervisors, it's the behaviors they inculcate to signal to everyone that they belong, they are valued, their input is appreciated, that they are included. So every organization is based on equity and inclusion. And that intersection determines whether an individual in that organization is motivated or engaged. So we talk about EIIE in the real sense. Reframing, I will come to that other aspect of your question. But the first part of your question is this, that unfortunately, for many years, the relationship between stress and well-being, and in fact, stress and significant aspects of health, was really not appreciated. And the other thing that is not appreciated is that employees take that back home, and that stress that they have experienced in the workplace, they then take home, and that damages the interaction in the home. So another dysfunction and well-being issue is created in the home because of stress in the workplace.
Yeah, that's a good point. It goes back to those values, doesn't it? And the aspiration versus the actual implementation. Yeah. I'm glad to hear there are actual studies and statistics to back it up, because it feels like that should be a no-brainer, doesn't it? That if people are stressed at work, they're not going to be as productive.
Yes.
And yet, it doesn't seem as obvious as it should to so many people. Yeah, I think back, even when I entered the workplace for the first time, you get to that point where you say, look, I'm really stressed out. And the response you would get from your manager would be something like, well, yeah, so am I. So what? What makes you special?
Yeah.
I was like, okay, well, yeah, that might be true, but it's not that helpful, is it? And you're not solving the problem, you're perpetuating it, if anything. And yeah, you're so right about taking it home and the impact it has on family life as well. And I think this is one of the reasons, not just for the question of stress and anxiety, but leadership generally, why I see it as such a responsibility and a privilege as much as it is something to aspire to, because you're not just having that impact on the people you work with, the people you lead. That in itself should be enough for you to take it seriously, but everyone in their circle as well, isn't it? it's their spouse when they go home, if they've had a terrible day or you've mistreated them, then the spouse has to hear it, and then that stresses them out, and then they'll talk to their friend, and there's, it's almost like the exponential stress curve, isn't there?
Yep. It is the pebble that you think it's a pebble that you drop in the pond, and you see the waves.
Yeah. That's a much better analogy. I like that much better. Thank you. Tell us then about your reframing process and how does that work and what's it do?
In 2019, end of 2018, actually, 2019, published my memoirs. And as I was writing an incident I will share with you, something occurred to me. And here's the incident. After I completed my PhD in chemistry at Cornell University, I got a job at Xerox. And for 3 months, I couldn't get a good project. And one day, a young white man joined the group. And within a week, he was placed on what was the most attractive project we had in research and development at Xerox at the time. So I went to my boss to have the usual conversation. And suddenly I said to him, Steve, don't think of me as though I'm Frank. Think of me as though I'm Bob. And I was just stunned to see the recognition come over his face as he looked at me and he said, Bob has been here a week and I've put him on the artery project. Well, I was furious. I ran out of his office, down to the office of the senior vice president, to give him another example of my being discriminated against. That actually led me to go to medical school because I decided if I were a doctor and I had my own office and I was seeing patients and I didn't have to be part of an organization, nobody could discriminate against me. And so I went to medical school. And about a couple of years of being in medical school and learning different things, I reflected on that incident and recognized I'd made 2 errors. The first one was that Dr. Tribus, the senior vice president, who at that time had been at Xerox for about a year, had made it very clear that he wanted to have more scientists of color in the company. And that summer, he had hired 3 young Black PhDs to join the single Black PhD that Xerox had in research and development at the time. So it probably was more important to Dr. Tribus that Frank Douglas would do well than it probably was to Frank Douglas, because he'd put himself on the line. The second thing that I missed was my desired outcome. What was the outcome I wanted? It was not for the senior vice president to go and have tough words with my boss. I just wanted a good project to show what I had learned in my PhD. That's what I wanted. So had I reframed this, and had I gone to Dr. Tribus and had I said, Dr. Tribus, can you help Steve, my boss, find me a good project? I might have retired from Xerox. For heaven's sake, he was 3 levels above my boss. He would have gone in and he would have said, find a man a good project. It would have happened yesterday. Now, as I was writing my memoirs and I wrote that incident in my memoirs, it suddenly struck me that I had actually learned from it. And the way I had dealt with issues of discrimination thereafter, I was reframing. Now, what is reframing? Reframing simply is finding another project to solve, the solution to which will not only address your issue, but will also benefit others in the unit. So that is the challenge of reframing. And so we've developed an approach to it.
Interesting story as well. I'd have to ask, though, do you regret that you handled it that way?
I don't know what my life would have been like Xerox and what contributions I would have made. I have no regrets of the life that unfolded thereafter. I mean, I've had a wonderful life and opportunities to contribute, and that's the thing that I focus on. opportunities to contribute. And being in medicine actually opened up much larger opportunities for contribution directly to patients, research that benefited patients, and being in large organizations where my leadership benefited scientists and younger people who then benefited others and produced the drugs. So the multiplier effect of this has been perhaps much greater than if I had stayed in Xerox, but who knows?
Yeah, I mean, we're back to the ripples in the pond again, aren't we?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's hard to know, the what if scenario.
Yeah.
But
I actually, with one exception, where I question, it's not a regret, but I have no regrets for anything that I have done, regardless of how it turned out, because I tell people simply that I do not know if I'd gone in the other direction, what the path would have been and what the outcome would have been. So I'm just very happy that, I've had the opportunity to be on paths that contributed to others.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to look at it, isn't it? And it's, again, I mean, it's the reframing, isn't it?
Yes.
It wasn't a mistake; it was a lesson.
It was a lesson. No, it was a lesson.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe not in those exact same circumstances, but I think anyone can relate to that, the knee-jerk reaction, the reacting when you're angry or upset about something. And I think that's why it's such a powerful piece of advice about that you hear so many times, and when you hear it like that, yes, that's the right thing. That's what I should have done, which is sleep on it, or just wait until you calm down before you do anything. And yet in the moment, it is so difficult to actually do that, isn't it?
Yeah, well, this is why we've set up the reframe process the way we do. When someone comes to us with a problem of discrimination, of course, it's very hurtful, very emotional. And the thing which I have found is that often if you ask that individual, well, have you talked with your manager? Have you talked with your supervisor? They say yes, but they're not listening to me. They're not hearing me. And so, we're focused on the individual to let that individual know, first of all, they're being hurt. So we start actually, interestingly enough, with what's the outcome you desire? And that does two things. It signals to them that you want to hear, because you want to hear what relief it is they want from their pain. So you want to hear about their pain and what relief. But it does the second thing. It gets them to step back a little bit from the emotion and to start to look at it a little bit more, systematically. But the emotion will always be there. But to come to a resolution, you do have to step back a bit from the emotion. And so we start with, what's your desired outcome? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and I can see that being useful in all kinds of situations, not just something where there's a stressful event or something has happened, but even just like mentoring the people that you're leading. I mean, that can be such a powerful question, can't it?
Yes. It also works in conflict, as a matter of fact. Yes, I was called by a woman who is an IT specialist, CIO, Chief Information Officer, and leads an organization. And she said, I've read your book, and I wish I had read it when I first joined industry. But I think it is useful for conflict resolution. And I said, I hadn't thought of it that way. To cut a long story short, she engaged me to set up a workshop. I worked with her team. I said, send me 2 cases that you have, and let's work in it. And we had a workshop, and she was absolutely correct. And she wrote in LinkedIn that it was actually revolutionary, the workshop that they had, as they approached using the reframing method for conflict resolution.
Well, that's always really nice to hear, isn't it? When people find new uses for what you come up with. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. and no, that made me feel very good because, as you said, it has broader use than that which I intended it for and which I'd used it for. And what is very nice, colleagues who know me and who read the book and engaged, so often they called me up and said, I had a problem and I reframed. And I've come up with such a better solution. So reframe has become part of their jargon.
Excellent. Yeah. So, going back to the two issues, the two themes we talked about so far, we've got the systemic discrimination, let's call it, and then the stress at work, the burnout. Yeah. How do you think those are interconnected? I mean, maybe it's obvious, but I'm going to ask anyway. And what should we all be doing in the workplace, at least, to try and improve those situations, improve the outcomes?
Well, as I've mentioned, stress does impact well-being, does impact productivity, does impact what happens at the home. I mentioned a study which I was so glad was done, which demonstrates the impact of discrimination on creating stress. And, what is not appreciated is what is stress. The thing that is bad about stress is usually something that is external, that is placed on you. It might be emotional, it might be physical, it might be mental. That's been placed on you. It is external. And often you are in a situation where you are, in a way, you're the victim. Namely, you don't have the power to change it or which to deal with it. And this is why, what we offer is so important. Because, as I said, basically, at the simple level of being heard, if you're not in a situation where you can describe the pain that you're feeling, that this external issue has placed on you, that is now causing you stress, causing you to feel worried, to feel overwhelmed, and to feel that you have no way of productively dealing with it and getting out from under it. Then you begin to understand what discrimination is like. It produces the stress, because discrimination basically is someone who has power over you having a prejudicial view, and whatever that prejudice is, and acting on that prejudice to your detriment. So discrimination produces stress because, again, as I said, it's an individual who has power placing a stress on you that you have no way of dealing with, of minimizing, of having a dialogue around, and after a while you become overwhelmed by it.
From a leader's perspective, or a manager, supervisor, whatever, someone in a leadership role, what do you think are the key symptoms, the red flags, the signs that we should be looking out for to identify things like stress or anxiety or burnout in the people we're leading, but also, I think, just as importantly, in ourselves?
Burnout is the final thing that happens. I mean, it can be mental, physical, emotional, where you're just simply exhausted. And when that happens, it is not subtle. But even then, depending on the culture you're in, persons may blame the individual who suffered burnout and simply say, they did not know how to manage their job, how to manage the projects that they had, etc. Or they were at a level that they were not yet prepared for. All sorts of excuses are given. some of which may be accurate, but some of which may actually come from other issues like discrimination that have become, overwhelming. The fascinating thing about leaders is that often leaders are so far removed that what they see is the average. They see the aspirational things, and they measure how they are doing, generally on these aspirational things. They don't see the experience, the culture that individuals are experiencing. And as I said, leaders are responsible for the equity side of the equation. For them to really understand what's going on in their organization, they have to also look at the inclusion side. They have to have those types of dialogues, those types of interactions that help them to see. Now, one way we suggest to do this, DI has been doing a wonderful job in raising awareness, particularly for middle-level managers, in terms of some of these systemic issues that they may be unaware of, how to manage them, how to deal with them, how to conduct meetings that are more inclusive, etc. Okay. Well, what we suggest is the following. Identify, and it won't be that hard to do, identify individuals who have complained that they're being discriminated against and they're not getting a hearing, and put them through our process. And if you find that you have got 5 or 6 individuals who have got similar issues, that's enough to tell you that you have a cultural problem at the level of that which is being experienced, and maybe even at the level of what is actual. So our approach is not only a therapeutic approach, if you like, for the individual. It can also be a diagnostic approach for the company.
Yeah, and I think it's a good way to look at it. I mean, again, I can see beyond the systemic and the discrimination, and you're right. I mean, things like bias training, they're making such a big impact on these kinds of issues. That kind of way of almost minimizing it that leaders have, and it makes me think about issues like staff retention as well. And we've talked about engagement already too, and you hear it, don't you, at conferences or whatever, the leader, whoever that may be, and they're complaining about, just it's really difficult to get the staff these days, and they don't stick around, and people and Gen Z, they're just lazy, all these kind of horrible sort of generalizations. And they never stop and think, like, how many people have to leave your business before you think maybe the problem isn't them, it could be you or your management style? Again, it links back to so much that we've already talked about, doesn't it?
It is, and unfortunate. In fact, my book is called "Until You Walk in My Shoes," and part of the process is indeed to get one to walk in the shoes from a viewpoint of equity and inclusion of the aggrieved individual. So until you walk in someone else's shoes, you really don't have a sense of the pain that they are feeling.
Yes, indeed, which is why empathy routinely tops the lists of key leadership qualities for the future, doesn't it? So,
well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because, when I'm asked that question, what for me are the top leadership qualities, I'll tell people, for me, are the 4 E's, and one of them is empathy. Showing empathy. Another one is empowering the people working for you. But empowering, we have to be careful, because some people think empower means I can do whatever I like. I've been empowered. No, being empowered is being clear on what you can work on autonomously and what requires a prior discussion, with your chief, with your manager. Being clear on on those 2 things, that's empowerment. And the third one is leading by example. So if I've got these core values and principles, I have to try to lead. And if one of them is collaboration, then when I'm working with my direct reports, I have to work in a collaborative manner, not in, a top-down manner. And part of that collaborative manner is what I call, being evocative, namely having the types of discussions that excites them and evokes, their thinking and helps them to get excited about solving things and, help them to bring things forward. So, I have my 4 E's, but at the top of the list is the one you mentioned, empathy, being prepared to walk in the other person's shoes.
Yes, I think for me, leading by example is probably the top one, because there's so many of these other issues we talked about. So like the example of the unsympathetic manager who's like, well, I'm sorry you're stressed, so am I, what do you want me to do about it?
Yeah.
The opportunity to lead by example there is, as the manager, maybe think about why you're stressed. And maybe you need to manage your workload in a way that you're not stressed, and thereby you're not setting being stressed as the example for everyone in your team.
What you need to do about it is to take care of your stress, then you'll be able to help me with mine.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. But again,
that's why I'm stressed.
Yeah. I mean, I'm being a little bit flippant about it, and I know it's not always that easy in practice, but you've got to start with that, I think, in that sort of situation. And then empowerment. Yeah, I agree with you there as well. I think you're absolutely right when you say it can be. You've got to be very careful with it. It can be a double-edged sword, because I've also seen it be used by, probably unfair to say the lazy leader, but you know what I mean, I think, if I say that, to just abdicate all responsibility. It's like, well, it's not my problem anymore. You're empowered. You deal with it, right?
Well, it's actually both ways.
Yeah.
It is the lazy leader, and it is also the runaway, manager reporting to you.
Yeah.
Who, says, now I'm empowered, I can do whatever I want to do, and who fails to realize that he or she is still working within an organization, and the boss has a much wider view of the goals of that organization and the goals of the project and how the project that you are doing fits. So it is both. And in fact, the reason why I stress the two things is that when I first, got to the C-suite, I saw a lot more of that, of employees who felt now they were empowered. They're running businesses, and they were empowered to run the business. And I would say to them, you're empowered to run the business, but you're not empowered to ruin it. And it's you'll be surprised how easy it is to go from run to ruin.
No, I wouldn't. I think it's one of the many things, I think, where balance is the key. But also I think context matters as well, and like how much you would empower a new starter who's on their second day working in the company is probably very different, like a 20-year veteran who knows more about things than you do. Yeah. And again, you've got to have that ability to be slightly flexible and adaptable if you're going to be a successful leader, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And it's one of my pet peeves about age discrimination, because we lose an awful lot of the knowledge, not only historical as such, but the actual practical knowledge of what has been the outcome of different approaches and what has been learned over time from different approaches. We lose a lot of that when we, focus primarily on having a young workforce that is very, very excited, has lots of new ideas, but don't have a concept of what, and sometimes reinvent the wheel just in a different fashion, on a different looking wheel.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I do think those new ideas are important as well. And
No,
again,
they're very
we're back
important.
to the balance word, aren't we?
Yeah, let's ask, the context, and let's ask, has something like this been done before? What did we learn from it? How can I take this new idea and make it so much better?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in an ideal world, you take the best from both of those viewpoints, don't you? And you get the absolute best outcome. But at the same time, in my experience, sometimes as a leader, you just have to let people make the mistake
Yeah,
because they won't learn it any other way.
yeah,
Which is really difficult, of course, to do.
yes, and like everything else, you have to to know where the sink line is. So
Yeah, and try and make sure the mistake happens in a low stakes part of the
yes.
business if you can. Yeah,
Yeah.
I know, but if you have the choice anyway. So I mean, on the subject of leadership, from your career so far, then, well, from your 3 careers,
Yes.
what would you say is the biggest leadership lesson that you've learned?
I think the biggest leadership lesson that I have learned, well, as a matter of fact, is 2. As a leader, personally, the things that I personally have to do, like leading by example, and like having empathy, and that's what I control about myself. And then how do I help others to achieve, what they have to achieve, to be proud of what they are doing, and to grow. And it's the other two E's, to empower them, and in discussions with them, have those discussions be learning sessions that are evocative, namely they are finding the solutions, not my giving them the solutions.
With all the bosses and managers you've ever worked for, what has been your best experience of being led?
My best experience, actually, and I can see him, and we've become very good friends. And there are 3 bosses I can think of who had this quality, with one of them in particular, and that was basically empowering me in the sense that I talked about it. Really giving me full autonomy to do the things I needed to do, and being very clear on what discussions we needed to have prior to my moving in the area. Well, because of that interaction, he didn't really have to, after, we started working together. I realized that the collaboration part, because he did it way, it was therefore incumbent upon me to be sensitive to the things that he needed to know, and actually to go even on the other side of telling him things that he might not need to know, so that he was never surprised. And so that was part of, what I took. So in our interactions, I would give the by the way, so there'll be no surprise here. And sometimes it is a by the way, do you see any problems, even though, I have the authority to do this? Do you see any problems with it? And that relationship with him gave me tremendous authority, and led to, in fact, one of the major drugs we have on the market was a case where I went to him. As a matter of fact, a decision was being made to come out of the whole area, because the phase 3 study had changed, and I had just been given that responsibility of that whole department, and happened to be sitting in just to learn what had happened with this phase 3 trial. So we're sitting in with the review. And I left the review, and I went to him and I said, I can get this approved. They did the wrong study. And he looked at me and he said, well, since this failed, I was really hoping we get out of this business. And I said, could I explain to you why I think they did the wrong study? And I did. We talked And he looked at me and he said, because it's you, do it. That's now $1 billion a year drug. And it's the major drug for the long-term treatment of diabetes, for the daily treatment of diabetes.
Wow.
Yeah, his name is Dr. Richard Markham. I'd like to give him a shout out. There's a relationship that, he demonstrated that because of the relationship he developed in the way he led me, okay, he could demonstrate his confidence because of the way I also responded to that leadership.
Yeah, and it's hard to think of a better example than the billions a year that have resulted from empowering people, putting people first and building relationships and trust, having trust in the people you're leading. So anyone who says any of those things don't matter, I mean, now I've got a great case study. Thank you. Yeah, well, what an incredible story. Okay, so the next question, I think you may have already answered this, but I'm not sure, and I'm going to ask you anyway, give you the opportunity to give me a different answer if you like. But it's, if you could go back in time to the start of your career, what would you say to your younger self?
Reframe. Whether it is a personal issue, a social issue, or a scientific issue or question. In fact, many of the discoveries made in science were made because an unexpected result in an experiment, was achieved, and the scientists asked a different question and reframed based on that. So the one thing I would do and would advise the younger Frank Douglas to have done would have been to reframe across the board, whatever the situation.
Yeah, that's more or less what I thought you were going to say, but I'm glad I asked anyway. I'm trying to think of famous examples of things that were discovered by mistake when they were looking for something else.
Here's one. One. Sir Alexander Fleming.
I was about to say, is it penicillin? Yeah.
One of the greatest examples.
Yeah.
The other example, of course, is Einstein's theory of relativity. He asked a different question and looked at it differently, very differently, and as a result, discovered this relationship, between the speed of light and mass. And here we have the theory of relativity, on which now, quantum mechanics is built, but which basically has now enabled us to do things like go to the moon and back.
It's true. Yeah. Two very good examples, definitely. Yeah.
So understanding the physics and how that works has enabled us to do that.
Leadership Heroes.
Well, I've only got one question left, but this is always my favorite question. So it's called Leadership Heroes. And the question is, if you had to pick one person, it could be anyone you like, alive, dead, past, present, anyone from history if you want, or even someone fictitious if you prefer that. But it should be someone who, in your opinion, perfectly embodies leadership. So who would that person be and why?
Well, my two favorites, I gave you one, namely Dr. Richard Markham. I think he's a fantastic leader. And my historical figure that I liked is Socrates, because he asked the questions and, caused you to think and to discover. And I think that's an important aspect of leadership. Too often we think that what a leader is supposed to do is to bark orders and to say, go north. A greater talent of a leader is to evoke creativity, to evoke solutions, evoke thinking, in their direct reports and organization.
I would agree with that as well. And I mean, it's kind of what we talked about a bit earlier, isn't it? About asking the questions rather than, like, even if you know the answer, it's not about that, is it? It's about eliciting a different pattern of thought, isn't it? The people you're leading and letting them build the skills and the tools to find the answer on their own.
But also demonstrating that you are open to learning yourself.
Indeed. Yeah.
And that may lead to something that you had not thought about, and you may learn something.
Yeah, indeed. Plus, of course, where would science be without the Socratic method? Hey.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think you get bonus points for that because I don't think anyone's picked him before. Testing my memory, but I'm pretty sure that is a unique answer. So well done. Yeah, it's been a while since I've had one of those.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, Frank, it's been an absolute pleasure to meet you, and I've really enjoyed talking to you today. I am going to ask you one very small other question, which is if anyone in the audience would like to know more about you, perhaps get a copy of your book as well, where can they go to do so?
Okay, they can find the book on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's entitled Until You Walk in My Shoes, subtitle, A Reframing Methodology to Overcome Systemic Discrimination. But if you just look at Until You Walk in My Shoes by Dr. Frank L. Douglas on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And if you go to my website, which is safehavendialogues-llc.com, safehavendialogues-llc.com, you'll find a lot of information about what we do and about the reframing method.
Lovely. Well, I'll put some links as well in the description so everyone can find that easily. Well, that's pretty much all we've got time for. Thank you again so much for your time and have a great rest of your day.
Well, thank you for the invitation. And it was a nice, leisurely cup of coffee type discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that because that's always the goal. So,
No, I really enjoyed it.
Good. I'm pleased. Well, me too. Yeah, I did forget my coffee though. So,
well, I have mine here, but I did not take a sip. Now I'll take a sip.
Oh no! I hope it's still warm. Frank, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation today. And we touched on so many big and important topics, got into some real practical depth of understanding on some of our key subjects too. Listener, I hope you've learned as much as I have today about burnout, discrimination, leadership as well. I hope you've enjoyed the experience as I did too. And if you would like to reach out to Frank or learn more about anything you've heard today, please do click on the various links you'll find in the show notes below. Huge thanks again for being with us today, listener or viewer, if you're watching me on YouTube right now. Hope to see you very soon in our online leadership community, Integrity Leaders. Again, that link is in the show notes, but it's www.leadernotaboss.com. Sign up for the newsletter, join the community, or both, or neither. You're cool. Leave it to you, but do pay us a visit. And do join me again next week as we wrap up our series on burnout, on stress, on anxiety at work, with my next guest, who is the Chief Burnout Officer, his phrase, not mine, and founder of the Breakfast Leadership Network. He's also a fellow podcast host, and his name is Michael Levitt. Don't miss it, and until then, be a leader, not a boss.